Welcome to the Monday Morning Mixtape, the only podcast that'll satisfy all of your musical needs, regardless of genre. On this week's show, we're going to be taking a bit of a big look at punk pop, talking about the birth of it, its history, the prime of it. Then we're going to recommend some kind of like pop punk bands. I hate using the term pop punk. I think punk rock is a lot better for the bands that we're talking about. And we'll also be reviewing Good Charlotte's The Young and the Hopeless. So stay tuned. This week it's all about the punk pop. I suppose before we get into it, like I quite like punk music. I've listened to punk music most of my life, but I don't really like the term punk pop for some. Not that it really fucking matters anyway. Genres don't really matter.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, with the terminology to it, but like a lot of bands, because we're going to be talking about bands like Bad Religion and even Green Day, were just because they're kind of slightly more catchy. I don't think they're, not that there's anything wrong with popular music anyway as well, because that way then you're kind of saying that there's something wrong with popular music. But I think these bands, they're just punk bands. They're punk rock bands. Then when you get to stuff like Good Charlotte and things like that, then the later generation, I'd consider those punk pop. But then again, it doesn't really matter. So,
they just happen to be popular punk.
Yeah, it's just kind of like a handy, I suppose, way of kind of like classifying a certain type of music or a certain kind of thing. But yeah, so we're going to be doing a brief history of punk pop, where it started from. Then we're going to be giving some recommendations, like I said, and then near the end we're doing our classic albums. What we're trying to do with the show moving forward is we'll try and revolve kind of like a bit of the show around the classic albums, or classic albums around the show, so we can give people a little bit of an insight into things. Brief insight. If you want like fucking big, like me, one of the guys, Marcus from last podcast on the left, they started doing a music podcast roughly around the same time we started doing it as well. But they do like, say, 3-hour-long episodes about a band. We won't be doing anything like that. Yeah. This is just if you want to skim the surface of stuff.
A taster, if you will.
A taster, yeah. But I suppose getting started with like the old pop punk, I suppose kind of like, most people would consider like the 90s, the prime kind of like time for it. But before that, you go back, I suppose, when you do think of the early eras of it, I think a lot of it, it's the Ramones, I think, without a shadow of a doubt.
Yeah.
Would be the first band to kind of spring in.
Really, I suppose.
Yeah, so you're talking kind of like mid-70s, I suppose, kind of like, late 70s. Like they had the Jam as well. Generation X are one band that I think sound very, very, a lot of bands sound very similar to, but they don't get a lot of credit around it. But like on the British side of things as well, you had like the British side was massive. Like the Ramones, I think, probably captured the sound with it. And when we were looking at a documentary about the Ramones at one stage, and I thought what was kind of funny was that they were talking about it. They were saying people would have been horrified to know that we were actually into all this kind of like pop music at the time. This is what we kind of, I can't remember what term they referred to it as, but they were into the Bay City Rollers, and it was the Bay City Rollers inspired them to do the hey ho let's go kind of blitzkrieg bop
had their
thing.
Catchy kind of like shouted chorus kind of a thing.
But like, I mean, like the fucking the Ramones, I think they're still going and stuff. So it's one of the things I think we find, like the more that we'll be going through kind of like histories of different various versions of music and stuff. One of the things I think is that punk pop has a similarity to new metal. It's like where the original kind of like ones that were considered kind of like things, even though the genre is kind of like, looked on unfavorably, they're still around and they were good. It was just the imitators. It's the same with grunge. Bands like Puddle of Mud fucking come along copying kind of like
see, the originators are sort of, they break new ground, and then you have other people jump on the bandwagon and they dilute it, and they're kind of manufactured to produce a certain sound. They're like, there's money in this, let's go and do this, and then they ruin it for everybody. And that's what always happens, I think.
Well, it's the whole thing as well with, say, around the same period, kind of like late 70s, you had the Misfits. Now, because the Misfits were somehow considered punk rock, and then they got the term horror punk, I think a lot of the Misfits stuff was really, really catchy, and it was like based on old school rock and roll as well. So I think the Misfits could easily fall into that, because most of the punk stuff, they were trying to put a melody in it, and then what you had, like, say, the early 80s, like Black Flag, a lot of Black Flag stuff, even though they're considered hardcore. I think there was a bit of a melody. And then when they did the cover version of Louie Louie and all that, it's... But, we're saying about kind of like over this side of the pond. So say you had the Ramones over there, and then over here it seemed to kind of like, because England was seen as one of the birthplaces of punk, but whether it was or not,
Could be argued.
yeah. But you had like the Kinks. Or the fucking... I can't...
Sex Pistols, obviously.
Buzzcocks.
Never mind the Buzzcocks.
No, but like the Sex Pistols weren't punk pop. But like, what were the ones that had I'm turning Japanese? I think I'm turning Japanese. I really think so. And what the fuck? Well, you know these bands are better than I do. Because you're older than me. Well, the Undertones and Stiff Little Fingers.
I suppose they're Northern Ireland and all the rest.
Yeah. But those bands, they kind of like, they really popularised it, I think, over here, where there was a catchy kind of thing too.
Yeah.
And one of the things that ended up seeming to be one of the favourite topics as well, with like I'm turning Japanese, and was it Generation X? I think that, well, like, I mean, Generation X, a lot of people shit on them because like Billy Idol, and they seem to be somewhat manufactured, and they were more kind of like, with their pop leanings. And that nearly kind of like maybe somewhat inspired New Romantics. Kind of a thing, because a lot of those bands are new wave bands. They were pretty much punk bands, but they just didn't look like punks, and they had more pop sensibilities about them, and they brought stuff in like keyboard fucking things and all that, but they still had that catchiness there, but some of that kind of like aggression.
Okay.
Yeah. You know what I mean?
I do. Yes.
But so I suppose kind of like, it's like kind of like one of the bands that ended up become very important to kind of like the pop punk thing. They would have started off in the early 80s, as well as Bad Religion.
Yeah.
And like Bad Religion had an album, it's probably a little bit more aggressive than some of their other stuff in the early 80s, and then they decided to go a totally and utterly different way, and they did a prog rock album, which I didn't believe. I never knew this when I was looking into it. I was like a Bad Religion fan, or I am a Bad Religion, but I never knew about this prog rock album, and it was so bad, and people were like so disgusted by it, they just quit.
Yeah.
And then they came back years later.
They're like, hey, we're punk again.
But I suppose that in the 80s, kind of like the ones that were filling it all, the Descendants came along, and they had a kind of a heavy kind of hardcore album as well for the first one, and then they did an album that kind of really, Milo Goes to College, which ended up really being the template. I think
that was kind of the influential one for everybody, wasn't it?
Yeah, the Descendants are still... I think they're still on the go, but it would have been, if you listen to that album, it does sound, you can hear the influence very, very clear, kind of like, running the whole way through it. And then Husker Du is a band that I should know a lot better, but they're kind of considered one of the kind of like, forefathers as well, or that they were changed. But like, I mean, over those times, there wasn't much going on with punk, because what was really happening in the early 80s up until the late 80s with punk, it was like being dominated by hardcore and kind of like the scene. If you... Like, you haven't read it yet, but NoFX, they did their autobiography.
I need to get on this and read it.
Yeah,
keep on digging
brilliant.
it out and going to start
it's
it.
absolutely brilliant. But like, they were talking about how violent the punk scene was, that it was after Turner, where people were getting stabbed, and like there was always
just
fights.
turned up to fights, and that was it.
Yeah, it was horrendous. Like, and this is what punk was. It was after turning into it was always nihilistic. Anyway, that was a kind of like point. But like, a lot of people were like, "This isn't fucking fun. This is horrible." Like, and that would have led on to the birth of Gilman Street, which was a venue that a lot of punks put together that was run by people, that were going to it. It was like very much punk ethos, but a lot of the bands that would have ended up going on becoming big in the pop punk scene would have ended up playing there. But it was just that, because like you had was it Suicidal Tendencies would have been on to go at that time, were considered punk, but they were like very much had gang affiliations, but there was a lot of like violence, and that's what the punk scene was after turning into. Even you look at G.G. Allen, like I've seen shows of him. I'm not really a fan of G.G. Allen and stuff, but you look at
that's kind of terrifying.
The shows,
really.
they're like, what the fuck is the point?
Why would you go there?
Smeared in shit and someone fucking
I know,
punching your girlfriend and stuff. But it was after Descendant, so a lot of these guys are just like, nah, we don't want to do it, So I think a lot of the birth would have came from Gilman Street, where they went off, and that would have been kind of like, the beginning of a lot of it. So what you had playing there, you had like, well, a lot of bands. It would have been Bad Religion. Was it 87 they did Suffer? It was their comeback album, which would have been like the birth of pop punk, and it ended up inspiring a lot of the rest of the bands. So even like NoFX were on the go at that stage. They weren't really kind of like fucking doing anything spectacular. And when Fat Mike said that he was just about to quit NoFX and just cancel it all together, and then he heard Bad Religion suffer, and it was like, oh well, maybe this is something that I could come close to, yeah. So like NoFX going, and then as well, the whole thing kind of like, you know, there was Epitaph Records, which was set up by it's the guitarist in NoFX. I'm sure his name will come to me at some stage. Brett Gurewitz. He set that up, and that was originally on the go in the early 80s as well. But it was mainly just Bad Religion, and I think maybe the Vandals or something like that they released albums for. They didn't really do too well because he was fucking like shooting it all up into his fucking veins, basically, to any money time, so he wasn't running it. But they started that off again when they released a new Bad Religion album, and then they ended up signing an awful lot of the bands that would have come. Like they had The Offspring on their label at one stage. I think they had NoFX definitely. No, I think Green Day maybe did the first album, or maybe Green Day did the first album with the guy that had Gilman Street. I think it was Lookout Records or something like that. Yeah, Lookout Records, yeah. Basically, thing was kind of like Bad Religion just changed absolutely everything.
Revitalised the genre, really, I suppose, then, yeah. Yeah, sure. Shot in the arm.
Then you kind of like started going into the 90s. Then what you had, there was a lot of these bands that were inspired by Bad Religion that were around at that time as well, started kind of getting big because they're albums. So we had The Offspring, who were an awful lot of time very much overlooked a lot of this, because Green Day get a lot of the kind of the big kind of thing because Green Day were the ones, but The Offspring actually sold more albums, I think, than Green Day with Smash.
They really big at one stage there, didn't they?
They were massive for a long time. They're still massive. They ended up setting up their own record label as well later on, further down the line as well. But what ended up happening around that kind of like period thing was you had kind of like the birth of maybe kind of like California punk scene, because a lot of it was dictated or by, I suppose, New York punk scene was more kind of like hardcore punk, and then kind of like over you had California stuff started out, and like we won't even get into it, but there was like Northern California, Southern California, Eastern California, Western California, different scenes that all kind of ended up merging. So what kind of really kind of, it seemed to be kind of like a convergence of stuff. You had NoFX were starting to do really, really well. I think it was Drunken Public.
Punk in
Drublic, yeah, it was
very hard to say.
Big one that sold well, but they were getting like really, really big. Then you had Pennywise as well, which sometimes when you look into punk, but people don't talk about Pennywise too much, but they were fucking massive. And they still are really big, but they were like super influential in the whole thing. What happened was that there was like skate videos and the surf videos were starting to become big at the time, and people wanted to use the music for it, so they started using kind of like a lot of that punk stuff. So that got around over a lot of people that would never been exposed to it outside of Southern California or outside of California started hearing all these things when they're watching these videos. And then I think kind of like punk became synonymous with skateboarding and with, but Pennywise like got really big, and they started bringing, because Pennywise, they still do it, they were great for like smaller bands, bringing them out on tour with them and kind of breaking them. So you had Pennywise would have been working away in the background doing that. Bad Religion were kind of like building up their own thing, which it would have been from Pennywise, I suppose. The Warp Tour thing ended up kind of coming, but say going back to kind of like jumping ahead, it was the Gilman Street thing that was set up in the late 80s, where you had bands like Project Ivy were like really influential on people, and that was two of the guys who would have ended up forming Rancid were in that. So a lot of the bands were influenced by them as well, with the ska kind of thing, and as well very much the do it your own DIY ethos to the whole thing, which then ended up like Green Day ended up forming around in the mid 80s, I think, and they were playing in Gilman Street the whole time. Then what was it? The album Kerplunk was their first album, which did really, really well, and then it ended up in like a bidding war for Green Day, and then they were seen as kind of like selling out in the 90s, and this was like the proper when everything kind of like Green Day kind of like exploded. With Longview, I think, was the first one that was on MTV, and it got a lot of airplay. And of course, it kind of like met with people saying that they're after selling out, but because they went off to a major record label as well, this Gilman Street, which is still open, a venue kind of like which has punk bands playing it, they banned Green Day from playing because they're after selling out.
Yeah,
where it was like, I think they had like 50,000 sales or something like that on Kerplunk, which was like massive. at the time. I remember reading a thing with or seeing a thing with Greg Gurwitz where he was talking about record sales, and he was saying that in their head, like 50,000 records was seen as like platinum or gold